Welcome to the Edge You Magic New Educator podcast, the go-to show for supporting new educators navigating the exciting journey from campus to the classroom. Join your host, Dr. Sam Fessich, for a blend of inspiration, advice, and practical strategies, one cup of coffee at a time.
I'm Mike Brilla, host of the Inspired Teacher Podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hello, Edumagicians, and welcome back to another episode of the Edumagic Podcast. My name is Dr. Sam Fessich, and today I am super excited to have Dr. Mary Giles on the show. She's going to be sharing all about differentiated instruction and universal design for learning. So if you're a future teacher, new teacher, student teacher, turn up the volume because I know she's going to drop a lot of us today and so many examples of implementing that in the classroom. Dr. Giles, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. So let's jump in. And would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself and your teaching journey?
My name is Dr. Mary Giles. I started my teaching career in Mississippi. I'm now in Tennessee, yay. In the elementary schools, I started in second grade, taught there for 1 year, and then I looped with my students to third grade. And then I stayed in third grade like 7 years. From there, I became an academic coach where I coached teachers in the middle school section. And after that, I became an assistant principal. So it's been really fun working in the educational setting and working with the different grades of students and the teachers.
Oh, I love that. So we started in elementary, we hung out in third grade for a while, and then we became an academic coach and then an assistant principal. Dr. Giles, whenever you were a future teacher, a lot of our listeners are future teachers, did you imagine yourself as an assistant principal? Is this something you always wanted to do, or were you thinking more staying in the classroom?
I did not plan to go into the role of an assistant principal. I actually just wanted to teach. I remember telling some of my students, I never changed my career. When I was maybe middle school myself, I always said I wanted to teach. And so I think what changed is because I was able to work with students that struggled a lot more than other classes. And I finally said, man, I have something different that others do not have. So let me go out more and branch out and share my knowledge. And so from there, when I started to coach teachers, I was like, okay, this was frightening at first, but I think I want to do more. I want to touch and impact more people, the students and the teachers. And so that what made me go ahead and get my leadership license. And from there, I was like, oh, okay, I think I want to be a superintendent one day. And so that kind of just inspired me to keep going because I wanted to impact more than the students in my walls in the classroom. And so that what made me change.
Oh, I love that. But like you said, your role never changed. You're still an educator with a leadership title, but you're impacting so many more students and teachers than your 4 classroom walls had in the third grade classroom. Oh, I love that story. Thank you so much, Dr. Giles, for sharing that with us. And I think that leads right into our topic today. You shared, I enjoy working with students who struggle a little bit. And I think this opens up our conversation into differentiated instruction and universal design for learning. So let's start with defining some terms for our listeners. How would you define each of those? How do they work together? How are they different?
Okay, so just for the podcast purpose, I'm not really going to use the research terms or anyone's name because what I learned to take these terms and use them as my own because I had to own my classroom. So I want to just be frank. For me, differentiated instruction, which is tailoring my instruction to make sure all of my learners were successful when I was teaching. And then the universal design instruction came along a little later. But for me, I say, okay, I can put those two together, even though the differentiated instruction was more about the instruction, the content, the product, and the classroom environment. The universal design instruction, it was more for the entire curriculum. It was for the entire process. How do you give students feedback? How are you adjusting? What are you planning? What resources, what technology have you used? So they're different in a small way, but you really can put them together because they really to make sure that students learn. And it does not matter what ability they have or a disability they may have. The goal is to make sure you plan for it. So I really say put the two together so you won't have to worry about them separately, and make sure that you learning your audience to make sure you know what's the different students need in my classroom. What presentation will help them master this goal? I often, when I'm in my classroom, it didn't matter if I had Common Core, a scripted curriculum, or whatever the curriculum. My goal was to make sure that I can even modify it to make sure my students still mastered the standard. It didn't matter the curriculum. The curriculum was part of what my students need to learn, but I was the teacher to present it to make sure the end goal was met. So that's kind of the definition of the differentiated instruction, just tailoring my instruction to make sure that all my students learn. And then the universal design learning was more of what curriculum resources I have, what are in place already for maybe my different learners, and how can I modify that to make sure it's really meeting their goal throughout the beginning until the end. And I'm adjusting using differentiated practice throughout that. So if the scripted lesson may say, okay, give them 2 practice examples, but my differentiated part may say my students are still struggling. So I need to provide 2 or 3 different ways in a different practice, presenting it in a different way to make sure they learn and they're ready for the next step. So that's the reason I said I put them together, because it provides me to change my instruction ongoing.
Yes, I agree. I think the two terms play nicely together. They both relate to content delivery, curriculum design, and meeting the learners where they are and helping to scaffold them to where they need to be for that mastery learning. Thank you. That was a great description. So we can talk about what it is, but let's also go back and share about why. Why do future teachers, pre-service teachers need to know and be aware of differentiated instruction techniques?
And this is based on experience again. When I started teaching as a first-year teacher, I had to get to know my students. And a lot of them, I would say, like a lot of people are going to classroom, is very diverse with all type of diversity. And so the differentiated instruction allowed my students to master my standards, to make sure all of the ways they needed to learn and be presented the information. We used to talk about kinesthetically, auditory, but it goes deeper than that, because now I need to present, let's just say if I'm teaching a math lesson, yes, I need to provide visual, but I also need to get some of my students to touch some things, use some manipulative and play with it to figure it out. And then I need them to struggle a little bit and I not give them the answer. So all of these different methods allow my students to work through the process. We know now the curriculum requires students to think it out, talk about the steps. And so I could not allow my students to do that if I just provided words or if I just talked to them. I needed to give them a visual and then allow them to show me. And then I kind of facilitate, ask questions so they can manipulate things and even be wrong and then go back and fix it and tell me why. So I had to allow conversation. I had to allow errors. I had to allow manipulate. I had to allow visual. Then I had to allow them to create their own questions and give their own peers assessment. So when it comes to that differentiated, I did not hold anyone back. If someone told me, oh, this child had an IEP, I still had high expectations. So, but it was just a process of how I got that students to get there. But I did not stop them from getting to the next level. So it's very important because it creates mastery in that classroom. And it also allows the students to do the work and the teacher serve as the facilitator. And I can say this, all of my years that I taught, third grade was the first year of testing, but I never once scored below 90% passing on the state test. Mississippi had the third grade test for a very long time. And so I can just be thankful that those students and my audience that's listening, when students come in, When you do that first assessment, oftentimes 75 or 80% of your students are scoring in the red. And that's what it looked like when I taught. But I can guarantee we're using differentiated instruction. By the end of the year, I only had maybe 4 or 5% scoring in the red because I used differentiated practices every lesson. It did take time, but time was worth it because if we're planning, because my students mastered. That's the reason why I changed district and people still put me in third grade because what I did worked. So it's very important and it's less stressful once you plan it. Once you plan it, you can see your students taking ownership and becoming teachers themselves. And that's the beautiful thing about using differentiated instructions.
I have two follow-up questions to that. One would be, how do student or future teachers get started with getting to know their students' needs and how to differentiate that instruction? Because I think that can be an overwhelming first step. So how do they get started with getting to know their students' needs and how to differentiate and what works for the students?
The main thing I tell people, and we used to have this saying, eyes and ears, eyes and ears. The first thing teachers need to know is watch students, listen to students. That is everything, but eyes and ears are something else. And I say that because I used to go to school early in the morning and I go to the cafeteria and I look at how my students interact and how they talk and what they bring in. And so I was learning them in the morning. And then I would learn how they interact when they come down the hall. Then I was looking at them when they came to my classroom. And on the playground, I would just talk to them. And so in those conversations, I learned what they like. And so I was learning to be a better teacher from those type conversations. So when I would get to know them, then I'm like, when I get ready to present this lesson, my little boy told me that he loves video games. So when I get ready to rewrite this problem, I'm going to put a video game in it. But then another student told me that he likes rabbits. So in that video game one, it's going to be about rabbits. So now I'm learning who they are with basic things, but I'm including the conversation that they are familiar with into my lesson. Now, I'm also going to look at the data. I'm going to look at what it says in the previous years. I'm going to create my own data from this year because my first assessment, even if the district or the school does not give an assessment, I always start out with some mini assessment so that I can know what a student is bringing in because there may have been a change from the summer. They may have had a bad testing cycle at the end of the year when they did state tests. So I didn't let what students did the previous year guide my whole process of thinking because I wanted them to start new. And so that allowed me to get to know my students. And in the classroom, I gave students a lot of time to answer questions, talk to me about things, give me scenarios. If in that part on your lesson plan, and that asks you to activate students' prior knowledge, and a lot of people use other type words, but really that's what it means. I used to really have students talking so I can know what does this student know about it? How can this student add to my instruction or cause me to differentiate instruction by me just listening to what he knows? And he may not have known the whole standard, but he knew something. So now I'm going to expand that in my lesson. So as future teachers, you have to really have conversation with your students. I'm not a big fan in taking what other teachers say about a student. I'm a fan of using my eyes and ears and observing and collecting information based on me first meeting that student and then providing that instruction. And then if I'm looking at facial expression, that's when I say eyes and ears. During my lesson, if I notice a little expression that says, oh, he or she didn't quite get that, then I'm going to ask the question and I'm going to ask the student, could you explain kind of what I said, or do you need me to rephrase it? So now I'm with my students, I'm saying, okay, he or she didn't get that. So immediately I need to ask the question and provide a different method of presentation if my students can't repeat it. So that's the reason I said for a teacher, eyes and ears will be the most important practice. So they'll know when they need to adjust, when they need to ask questions, and when do they need to give feedback.
Thank you. That was wonderful. So many practical ways to use our observation skills, have those conversations with our students, ask those questions, seeing how you can best support and serve our students. And I did another follow-up question earlier when we were talking about why DI is important. You had shared about letting students struggle and then coming in and supporting them. Why is having that productive struggle important for students in their learning process?
It actually allowed them to think through a process and then explain it much better. As teachers, some of us are comfortable with giving them the answer or prompting them a little too much. And so I always say we have to let them struggle, because when they struggle, they start learning the outcome a little better. They're able to talk through it because they can tell you where they're going wrong. And once they identify where they're going wrong, you can help them change that process to understand it. And so struggling is not bad. Maybe sometimes just depends on what it is, but students need to struggle so that they can get to the step where they know how to self-correct. And when they self-correct, they learn how to hold self-accountability. So all of those steps are very important to our growth in our students, especially the different learners. So that's the reason I say it's very important to let them struggle. And then in the struggle, we learn where their misconceptions are. And so from the misconceptions, now I can go back and I can modify my instruction, because maybe as a teacher, I didn't present something well. So it's always important, because as the learner is learning and the teacher is learning during that process of struggling. So that's the reason it's a very important process so students can do, so that you can gather data from it and move on with the instruction. Once again, that's a part of the differentiated practice, letting them struggle, and then you modify the next step based on the outcome of what you saw.
I like how you shared that both teachers and students are learning in that process of productive struggle. And depending on the data that you get from that, you can then modify your instruction and modify your feedback. And maybe you give more practice problems that are similar, or maybe you can move on to other problems in that example. That was excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Giles. That was awesome. So before we finish out our episode today, could you give us a few examples of differentiated instruction? I know you shared a lot already. Are there any others that you'd like to share?
Just knowing that you can differentiate any subject you teach. It requires planning, but you can do it. I love differentiated reading. A lot of people don't differentiate reading and writing. One example for writing, I always allow my students to begin a writing from a prompt or very similar to what the state does, because I want them to be ready, but then they will have to add a picture to it so that I know exactly what they were talking about or meant, even if they were not a great writer. But I didn't change the process because someone who made face and then wasn't a better writer. What I did is I added to, or I changed my instruction based on what they needed. For example, some of my writers may have started out with 2 or 3 sentences, or I may have started with a sentence starter for some of them, and they had to fill in the blank. But they still had to include me their form of picture that matched what they filled in. And later on, as they continued with that sentence starter, they couldn't shift until they were ready. And once they were ready, they start adding things. Like I would say, okay, add me a little more vivid language, make it your own. And they would do that. And I said, okay, add me a complex sentence. So I would give them a list of things. And each week, if they were ready, that list was expanded. It would say, okay, now you're ready to add this. And so in that differentiated practice, not only was they learning to write, but I was also including some of those standards with the writing to better the writing. So yes, they were writing, and some was writing different levels of sentences and all of that, but it was differentiated based on my students' need. And oftentimes when writing, we'll just tell students, write a paragraph or write an essay, and then we go in and try to check everything, and we know we can't check everything. So with my students, I always just had a goal of what I was looking for, and they add a picture to it. So we could just work on that. And then we'll keep going each week. And so that was one example for writing. Reading, I did it very similar because I didn't like it to be different so much that my students lost focus and track. So for reading, if it was a comprehension story, they had to put it out in a picture so that I know that they were comprehending based on what they read. And so we would go and highlight things in the passage so that they pull out their picture, pull ideas for their picture. So that was some of the differentiated thing when it comes to the student practice. But when I would model this for them, and it would be all the time. And I love the fact that in my class, I also it was a day for students to be teachers. And so my students would be teachers one day a week, and they had to do the same thing, and we had to follow them. And so those were just some differentiating ways that we would do reading and writing. Math, we know we would draw a picture, we would use manipulative, we would make games, we would get on the floor, we would jump, we would do hopscotch. Like, we would do so many things in the classroom. I used to tell people, if they like a ball, okay, we're about to play. We're about to learn today with the ball. Let's draw it on the ball. And if your hand get on it, you got to tell me this. And so I used to just implement anything that would cause students to learn and enjoy the learning. And so those are some practice that I use. We would rap things. If it was an ideal or concept that was difficult for students, we would create a rap song or whatever they said. If they say, oh, we're just going to sing any song, R&B, or we're going to sing hip hop or country or whatever, I said, okay, let's put it together. And that would be our song for the week. And then we wouldn't change it. It's just if we had another concept, we had to add on. And so the students were responsible for adding on. Okay, we'd be like, okay, so what's the next verse going to sound like? For example, we had the 12 inches equal foot. And so they had to add that on to the multiplication rap song. And, it sounds differently. So I'm like, okay, you're responsible. But it was creativity. So we didn't have music in our school, but we made music become a part of our math lesson. And they were responsible for doing that. So those are some ways that you can differentiate your practices. It does not have to be a moment where it's not joyful. It's always a time where you can implement joy into the lesson. I know all times doesn't require to do that, but if teachers do that throughout the week, once they get ready to do that assessment, students are singing and dancing and tapping in their heads, and they can just apply what they learned. And I think that was some of the most amazing things that we did that allowed my students to master. And I also use a lot of anchor charts. I told them I could not draw very well, but by the time I talked to my students and convinced them I could, they would want an anchor chart for everything we did. They would even create their own. And I would put them up in the wall and tell the people, come see them. Because when my students did things, I praised it as though it was the best thing in the world. Mm-hmm. And I would always motivate my students like they were the smartest in the world. And so that's another thing I want to share with teachers. Make sure you're encouraging your students and providing them the most positive inspiration, because they will do whatever you ask them to do when you build that relationship with them. And so when it comes to any subject, just know to just look at it and see, who are my students? What are their background? What are the real world experiences they have, so that I can teach this lesson and they understand what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. I'll kind of end with this story. I'm like I said, I taught in Mississippi, and oftentimes on a state assessment, they always present information from the big states. And so one time they were reading something about a subway, and the only subway in Mississippi was the one that you ate at. So, and I started saying, well, I think we need to talk about subways, which multiple meaning words we often do, but students struggle with multiple meaning words, especially if it's not in their environment. So I said, okay, we have technology. So we went on this little virtual ride on the subway. And so my students realized then, okay, there is another subway. And so those are small things, but as teachers, we have to remember that there are so much language that's going to be on assessment. We don't want that to be a barrier to stop our students from mastering. Right. So when I taught, I made sure I implemented things that was in their world, but also that was outside in the other worlds that was very important for them to master standards. Because I found that many students did not fail assessment because they didn't know the standard. They failed because they didn't know the vocabulary. Mm-hmm. So I made sure my classroom was rich with vocabulary, and they had so many examples to make sure that they can master the assessment and the reading that was placed in front of them.
I love all the examples you provided, from reading to writing to vocab, all with differentiated instruction embedded within it. Thank you. Where can our listeners learn more about differentiated instruction and get in touch with you?
Well, I say always use research-based practices or peer-reviewed articles. I love going to some of those elementary level, like Reading Rockets or Learning A to Z. They always have things for educators and how to differentiate practices. But a lot of those websites that relate to your different learners, you have IRIS website. So I think those are very important. But like I did, I had to figure out what component of the differentiated instruction work best for my students. And I don't have to go into a long research-based definition. I just need to know as a teacher, what does this mean and what does it look like in my classroom to make sure my learners are effective? And then for me, I work now at the University of Tennessee at Martin. I work with future educators, which I've expanded who I impact, and I'm grateful for that. My email is mgiles7@utm.edu, and that's MNGILES. My phone number is 662-902-5465. I'm also on social media as Mary A. Giles on Facebook. So I can be reached in any way. I'm always willing to help. I tell people I'm not trying to make a profit in sharing how to help students be successful. I know it's very important, but I want to share because every student matters to me.
Right. Oh, I love that. That's successful. I love that. Thank you very much, Dr. Giles, for your time today. And I'll make sure I put the links to your social media and your email in the show notes, along with the IDEA, the IRIS, and Reading Rockets as well that you had mentioned. Thank you so much for your time today.
And thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the EduMagic New Educator podcast. If you found it helpful, please leave a rating and review or share it with a friend. Always remember, you have the EduMagic in you.